Hey everyone, Spencer here, and today I've got the Wrecka Krew to paint, and I'm using mostly contrast paints. This is one of the new kill teams in the Brutal Cunning expansion box for Kill Team, and I really had a blast painting these models. Games Workshop very kindly sent them through and asked if I could get at least one of them painted up for one of their upcoming community articles within a fairly tight time frame. When the box arrived, I wasn't actually sure what scheme I was going to go for, but then I saw this Blood Moon variation the Heavy Metal team had painted in the rulebook, and that gave me the inspiration to do a similar colour scheme for mine. I very quickly got one model painted so that at least I had something to submit to the article, and then got to work on the rest of the team. This was really good as it meant I'd effectively made a test model, and I could iron out any issues with the paint recipes before getting on to the rest of the boys. One thing with these minis is they do have a fair amount of options, especially for their heads, so I went with the open heads as I felt that they gave a better balance between the amount of skin and armour on show on the models. And I did make a slight conversion. I gave this guy a bigger rocket on his hammer, which also came in the set and is a weapon for one of the other models. With all these models, I generally went with the rule of cool rather than picking strategically from the rulebook. So onto the painting, and we started off with a Zenithal base coat. I went with Vallejo Model Air Red Brown for the primer, as I wanted a really dark, warm reddish brown under the Zenithal. I followed that up with Tamiya Flat White over the top. The Zenithal is a really nice way to start off any model really. You get to see where the highlights and the shadows on the model are, and you get to see all the details a little bit easier. Another reason I went for a brown primer and white Zenithal is that makes for a really fast and effective way to paint yellow armour, which obviously took up a lot of the space on the models. So I used Imperial Fist contrast paint over the top of these. You'll notice that the white becomes a really nice vibrant yellow, and the brown becomes like a nice orangey shadow colour. I brushed it on quite carefully, not completely overloading the armour areas, but just really brushing like a single layer on. This paint goes on really nicely without many streaks at all. Something that was a bit of an experiment in the scheme was the skin. I figured that if contrast over Zenithal could work really nice for yellow, why couldn't it work for green too? So I painted Plague Bearer flesh over the Zenithal skin, and I think the results are really nice for how much effort's involved. On the whitest areas you get a pale yellowy green, and a nice green in the midtones, and then fading into a greenish reddy brown in the shadows. For most of the rest of the models, it's just a case really of colouring the different elements, which there aren't really that many of. I went for Black Templar contrast paint for any cloth clothing, which is actually like a dark grey colour and works really nice with any Zenithal areas. One of the key features of Bad Moon armour is the black sections, so I picked out a few small armour areas per model to paint with Black Legion, which is basically a really nice fluid black matte paint. I tried to keep in mind maintaining good colour separation when choosing which areas to paint black and yellow. For any leather I used Cygor Brown. One thing with different contrast paints is that some have really strong coverage and some have weaker coverage. When you're picking which contrast paints to use for this kind of colouring game, you generally want to go for the stronger ones because you just want to use a single coat and get that colour down so that it reads as whatever material you're trying to paint. It's hard to know which ones are strong before you try them though, but then I guess that's what videos like this are for, so that you can know before you buy which ones to use and which not to. I'm not a big fan of painting with metallics by brush, they just feel like they take ages to go on. But the new P3 Cold Steel does have nice coverage, so I used that to pick out some of the metallic areas, like the toe caps, bits on the weapons, buckles and stuff like that. I just used it straight from the pot. Some of the models have cloth-like wraps on different parts of them, so I base coat these with AK Deck Tan, which is one of my favourite paints, and it's one that I'm going to be using a lot more a little bit later in the video. When the cloth parts had dried, I gave them a wash with good old Agrax Earthshade. The models have a lot of little power cables and rockets and other details that I wanted to contrast but complement the yellow, so I painted these with Flesh Terror Red. This is another contrast paint that has really nice coverage, so just a single coat will do. And that was all my base coats done, so then it was time for me to get onto washes and weathering. First up, the metallics needed some love, so I gave them a generous coat of AK Black Knight, which is one of their deep shade paints. These are like thick washes, and there's some really nice colours. The Black Knight gives a steel metallic a really nice grubby feel to it and a bit more definition, which I love. I gave the insides of the mouths and the teeth a wash with Volupus Pink. The main reason I do it this way around is because it's easier to paint the teeth on later when you've already got the pink of like the mouth and gums in place, rather than having to try and get the pink in place when the teeth are already painted and get any of that on the teeth themselves. One thing you might have noticed is that there's not a lot of definition on the model at the moment, and different elements blend together a bit. So I used some AK black panel liner around any areas where two elements meet or any recesses and rivets. The panel liner flows really easy into these areas when we touch the built-in applicator to them, so it's a really fast process. Sometimes a little bit too much flows off of the applicator, but we can clean these areas up with a brush dampened with some white spirits. Next, I wanted to add some rust to the armour, so I used AK Wargame Enamel Wash in the dark rust colour, and I found that there's two ways you can really use this. So the wash itself is really liquid, similar to the panel liner, so it can flow nicely into recesses and around rivets and make some nice streaks. But you can also use the dried up thicker paint that's in the cap of the bottle, and you can apply that as like a heavily rusted area. Because this is an enamel paint, it has a long working time, can be reduced using white spirits, and any excess can be mopped up with a cotton bud like I did on this fella's fists. I usually base at the end of painting a model, but I decided to do it at this stage as I figured it would save me a bit of time doing any weathering on the feet and legs at later stages. I wanted a simple desert base for this kill team, so I used AK Terrain's Sandy Desert, applied all over this base including any tactical rocks. I did some Deadlands tufts from Rival Crafts while the paste was still wet, and generously splashed on some AK liquid enamel pigment in the dust colour, making sure to get some on the feet and lower legs of the model to tie them into the environment. At this point, the models are looking really nice and everything is painted except for some details, but I thought they could do some highlights on the leather, the yellow and the black. Something you can do to really easily highlight something painted with contrast paints is to mix something like ivory, or in my case deck tan, into the paint on the wet palette and use that as a highlight. So that's exactly what I did. I used the Cygor Brown and deck tan mix to add some edge highlights and a few scratches to the leather to give them a bit more contrast and to help them stand out and have more character. With the Imperial Fist Yellow and Deck Tan mix, I added some rough edge highlights and scratches too, but I also used it to make the heavily rusted areas stand out by giving them an edge highlight on the lower edges of them. This gives the illusion that the rust is pitted into the armour. For the black armour, I skipped the mixing, but repeated the same steps as the yellow, just using Skaven Blight Dinge. Games Workshop recently changed the recipe for this and I'm using the new paint, which is a nice mid-grey, which is perfect for scratches on black armour. With those highlights done, I just had a few more details to finish off. For the teeth, I used the same mix of Cygor Brown and Deck Tan to base coat them, and I worked up through a couple of highlights to straight Deck Tan. Nothing fancy here, just making sure the highlight areas were smaller with each stage and going more towards the tips of the teeth. I have to apologise for the camera focus here, but for the eyes, I started with Hull Red from AK and painted the whole of the eyeball, then carefully made a smaller dot within that, but still covering most of the eyeball with AK Dirty Red, and the final dot just for the pupil of yellow. For the smoke on these rockets, I used a 50-50 mix of Black Templar contrast paint with water and applied that all over them. This let the red from the primer show through, but it gave a grey feeling to all the white areas, which works really well for like a fiery smoke. Then to give the rockets a bit of extra pop, I used the same colours as the eyes and worked from dark red through to yellow as it got closer towards the back end of the rocket. I worked over the areas a few times and found that making sure the orange was the predominant colour was the key thing to making it look right, so I made sure to leave a good chunk of that showing. And that's the Orks done. I'm really pleased with this kill team and the scheme overall. I feel like it's a fairly quick scheme that you could leave at certain stages depending on how much time you want to put into it. Like, you don't have to go all in on the weathering or highlights if you don't want to, or you could push them even further. Thanks for watching everyone, see you next time, bye!